He made waiters quit on the spot. Then a brave woman stood her ground and... Hello, viewer. Thanks for joining us. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. In 3 years working at Manhattan's most exclusive club, I'd seen grown men quit mid-sentence when Sterling Ashworth walked through those doors. But tonight, he was about to meet someone who wouldn't run. Brenna Calloway adjusted the fresh orchids on the mahogany reception desk, her emerald eyes scanning the afternoon schedule. The Sterling Club hummed with its usual understated elegance, crystal chandeliers casting warm light over leather armchairs where billionaires discussed mergers over single malt whiskey. Her phone buzzed. Indy's name lit up the screen. Brenna smiled, answering with practiced quiet professionalism. "Hey, sweetheart, how's the dress fitting going?" Indy's excited voice bubbled through the speaker. "It's perfect, Bree, but listen. The florist called about the centerpieces for the reception. They need confirmation on the final count by tomorrow. 2 weeks until the wedding." Brenna's chest tightened with familiar protective love. She'd raised Indy since their parents died in that car accident when Indy was 16, 11 years of being sister, guardian, and cheerleader all rolled into one. "I'll handle it tonight," Brenna promised. "Everything's going to be beautiful. Indy, you just focus on being happy. You sound tired. Are you sleeping enough?" Brenna glanced around the club's opulent lobby. Sleep was a luxury she couldn't afford while juggling her senior concierge position and finishing her graduate degree in non-profit management. "I'm fine, really. I know you are. You always are. But Bree, you deserve to be happy too. You know that, right?" The question hung in the air like morning mist. Happiness seemed like something other people got to experience. Brenna had responsibility. That was enough. It had to be. "Of course," she replied smoothly. "I'll call you tonight about the flowers." After hanging up, Brenna returned to her work. Mrs. Wellington approached the desk, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, wearing anxiety like expensive perfume. "Miss Calloway, I have a catastrophe. My grandson's engagement party is tomorrow night, and my event coordinator just called in sick. I need a jazz quartet, catering for 60 people, and a cake that screams sophistication. Can you work miracles?" Brenna's fingers moved across her keyboard with practiced precision. "Absolutely, Mrs. Wellington. The Blue Note Quartet is available, and I know they'll be perfect for your event. For catering, I recommend Artisanal Affairs. They specialize in intimate gatherings with elegance. As for the cake, Dominique Ansel has a last-minute cancellation for a 3-tier vanilla and lavender creation that would be stunning." Within 20 minutes, Brenna had orchestrated what most people would consider impossible. Mrs. Wellington's eyes actually misted with relief. "My dear, you are absolutely invaluable." "How do you manage such miracles?" "Experience and excellent contacts," Brenna replied with a modest smile. "Your grandson's party will be memorable for all the right reasons." As Mrs. Wellington glided away, Marcus Thompson appeared at Brenna's elbow. Her colleague's dark skin had an unusual pallor, and his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his tie. "Brenna, we need to talk." "Sterling Ashworth called. He's coming in tomorrow." The name sent a chill through the club's perfectly climate-controlled air. Sterling Ashworth, heir to Ashworth Industries, worth approximately $3.7 billion, and the only member who made grown professionals quit their jobs rather than serve him. Brenna kept her voice level. "What time?" 2 o'clock. He specifically requested the senior concierge. "That would be me." Marcus shook his head, worry creasing his forehead. "Brenna, in the 2 years I've worked here, I've seen 12 different staff members quit on the spot after dealing with him. Grown men, experienced professionals, just walked out mid-conversation rather than endure another minute of his attention. What exactly does he do? He finds your weakness and exploits it, publicly, ruthlessly, like he takes pleasure in watching people break." Marcus lowered his voice. Sarah from accounting lasted 10 minutes before she ran out crying. James, that big security guard, he quit after Sterling made one comment about his grammar in front of other members. Brenner processed this information with characteristic calm. Everyone has weaknesses, Marcus. That doesn't mean they get to define us. This guy is different. Bree, he's not just mean. He's strategically cruel, like he studies people specifically to destroy them. Then he'll be disappointed tomorrow, won't he? Marcus stared at her. You're not worried? Brenner turned back to her computer, fingers resuming their steady rhythm across the keys. I've been taking care of myself and my sister since I was 16. Marcus, I've faced down social workers who wanted to separate us, bill collectors who threatened our home, and professors who said I'd never succeed. One difficult member isn't going to break me. But what if he... Brenner looked up, her green eyes holding steady confidence. Marcus, some people try to make themselves feel powerful by making others feel small. That says everything about them and nothing about us. Mr. Ashworth can bring whatever attitude he wants tomorrow. I'll be ready. As Marcus walked away, still shaking his head, Brenner touched the small silver frame on her desk. Inside, a photo of her parents on their wedding day smiled back at her. Right beside it, a graduation photo of Indy in her cap and gown from Columbia University. She'd protected what mattered most. Tomorrow would be just another test, and Brenner Calloway had never failed a test that truly counted. Sterling Ashworth might make other people quit mid-sentence, but he was about to discover exactly what happened when an unstoppable force met an immovable object. The morning arrived grey and drizzling. Manhattan's typical autumn mood settling over the city like expensive melancholy. Brenner arrived at the Sterling Club 30 minutes early, her navy blazer pressed to perfection, her dark hair pulled back in a sleek chignon that suggested both professionalism and quiet authority. Marcus intercepted her before she reached the reception desk. Called in sick, he announced without preamble. Who? David. He was supposed to handle Ashworth today, but apparently he's developed a mysterious flu that'll last exactly until Sterling leaves the building. Brenner set down her leather portfolio, unsurprised. So I'm covering. Bree, you don't understand. David's been here 5 years. He's handled foreign diplomats, Fortune 500 CEOs, even that oil minister from Saudi Arabia who made everyone nervous. But Sterling Ashworth, he chose food poisoning over facing that man again. Then David made his choice, and I'll make mine, Brenner replied calmly. What does Mr. Ashworth usually require? Marcus consulted his tablet, voice dropping to a whisper. He comes in, demands perfect service, then finds fault with everything. Last month, he made Jennifer from guest services cry because she pronounced concierge with too much emphasis on the second syllable. She quit that afternoon. What was she supposed to say? That's just it. Nobody knows. He never actually explains what he wants. He just destroys people for not reading his mind correctly. Brenner straightened her shoulders. Then today, he'll learn to communicate his needs clearly, won't he? At exactly 2 o'clock, the club's heavy glass doors opened. Brenner felt the change immediately. Conversations quieted, staff members suddenly found urgent tasks elsewhere, and the air itself seemed to tighten with apprehension. Sterling Ashworth entered like winter given human form. He stood 6'3", with platinum blonde hair that caught the light like expensive silk, and ice-blue eyes that seemed to catalogue every imperfection in their path. His charcoal suit was clearly bespoke, probably Italian, and fit his lean frame with mathematical precision. Everything about him whispered power, wealth, and absolute intolerance for anything less than perfection. Several members glanced up from their newspapers, then quickly looked away. Even the seasoned waitstaff moved with unusual caution, as if sudden movements might attract predatory attention. Sterling approached the reception desk with measured steps, his gaze landing on Brenner like a searchlight, finding its target. "You're not David," he stated, his voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to immediate deference. "No, sir. I'm Brenna Calloway, senior concierge. David is unavailable today, but I'll be happy to assist you." Sterling's pale eyes narrowed slightly, studying her with the intensity of a chess master evaluating an opponent's opening move. "Unavailable? How convenient. I can certainly call him if you prefer. That won't be necessary. I need directions to the Windsor dining room." Brenna maintained perfect composure. "Of course. The Windsor dining room is located on the second floor, accessible via the main elevator or the mahogany staircase to your left. Take the stairs to the landing, turn right at the oil painting of the yacht Regatta, and continue down the corridor until you reach the double doors with the brass nameplate." Sterling's expression remained glacial. "Your directions seem unnecessarily complicated for what should be a simple request." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Other staff members had found reasons to linger nearby, perhaps expecting another victim for Sterling's legendary cruelty. Marcus watched from across the lobby, his face pale with anxiety. Brenna kept her voice professionally pleasant. "The dining room is exactly where I indicated, Mr. Ashworth. If you'd prefer someone else to guide you there, I'm happy to call security to escort you out entirely." The words landed in the marble lobby like stones dropped into still water. Conversation stopped. A newspaper rustled nervously. Someone's teacup clinked against its saucer with unusual emphasis. Sterling Ashworth stared at her, his ice-blue eyes widening almost imperceptibly. In the absolute silence that followed, Brenna could hear her own heartbeat, steady and strong. She'd spent years defending Indy from social workers who thought they knew better, professors who underestimated her capabilities, and landlords who tried to intimidate young women living alone. One wealthy man with an attitude problem didn't even register as a significant threat. Sterling's jaw tightened. His gaze traveled from her calm green eyes to her straight shoulders to her hands, folded peacefully on the desk. For a moment that felt like an eternity. Neither of them moved. Then Sterling did something unprecedented in the Sterling Club's recent history. He smiled, not warmly, not kindly, but with something that looked suspiciously like surprise. "Well then," he said quietly, "the Windsor dining room, second floor. Oil painting of the yacht Regatta. That's correct, sir." Sterling nodded once, sharp and decisive. "Adequate directions, Miss Calloway." He turned and walked toward the mahogany staircase, his footsteps echoing against the marble with military precision. Brenna watched him climb the stairs, noting the straight line of his shoulders and the controlled power in his movements. Marcus appeared at her elbow, eyes wide with disbelief. "What just happened? I gave a member directions to the dining room." "Brenna," he smiled. Sterling Ashworth smiled. "That man hasn't smiled in this building since the Clinton administration. Maybe he just needed someone to treat him like a human being instead of a natural disaster." But as Sterling disappeared around the landing, Brenna found herself staring at the empty staircase longer than strictly necessary. Something had happened in that exchange, some shift in the carefully maintained balance of power that she couldn't quite identify. For the first time in 3 years of flawless service at the Sterling Club, Brenna Calloway found herself wondering about a member long after they'd walked away, and somewhere in the back of her mind, a treacherous voice whispered that Sterling Ashworth's unexpected smile had been far more dangerous than his legendary cruelty. The afternoon continued with its usual rhythm, but Brenna couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. When closing time arrived and the club emptied of its distinguished members, she sat alone at the reception desk, touching the silver frame that held her parents' wedding photo. Tomorrow, Sterling Ashworth would probably return to his usual routine of calculated destruction. But today, for exactly 37 seconds, he'd looked at her like she was the first person in years to surprise him. And Brenna had the unsettling suspicion that she'd surprised herself too. 3 days passed before Sterling returned. But when he did, Everything felt different from the moment he walked through the club's mahogany doors. This time, he approached the reception desk with purposeful strides, ignoring the usual nervous stirring his presence created among staff and members alike. His pale blue eyes found Brenna immediately, as if he'd been thinking about exactly where she'd be standing. "Miss Calloway," he said without preamble, "I require your assistance with dinner arrangements." Brenna looked up from her computer screen, maintaining the same professional composure that had served her so well during their first encounter. "Of course, Mr. Ashworth. What can I arrange for you?" Sterling placed a sleek leather portfolio on the mahogany desk. "Tomorrow evening, 7 o'clock. 4 guests, all with specific dietary restrictions and impossible schedules. They'll expect perfection, and I intend to deliver it." Brenna opened her own notepad, pen poised with practiced efficiency. "What type of cuisine preference?" "Contemporary American, but elevated. One guest is allergic to shellfish, another follows a strict Mediterranean diet for health reasons. The third requires gluten-free everything, and the fourth—" Sterling paused, his ice blue eyes meeting hers directly. "The fourth is my business partner's wife, who has the most discerning palate in Manhattan and will judge everything from the wine selection to the thread count of the table linens." Brenna's fingers moved steadily across her notepad. "I recommend Chef Anderson from Meridian. He specializes in contemporary American cuisine with international influences and handles dietary restrictions, like an artist working with different paint colors. For wine, I suggest a consultation with our sommelier, though I'd lean toward a 2018 Chablis and a 2017 Pinot Noir from Oregon for versatility with multiple palates." Sterling's eyebrows lifted slightly. "You know wine. I know my job, Mr. Ashworth." He leaned forward almost imperceptibly, studying her with renewed interest. "What about the table setting? My partner's wife notices everything." Brenna didn't hesitate. "Wedgwood china with the subtle gold rim, elegant without being ostentatious, crystal from Baccarat, silverware from Georg Jensen, fresh orchids for centerpieces, but small arrangements that won't interfere with conversation, candles, but LED ones designed to look like flames, no risk of wax accidents with expensive clothing, and if she's still not impressed, then she has unrealistic expectations, and that's her limitation, not your hospitality." Sterling went completely still. In the 3 years Brenna had worked at the Sterling Club, she'd never seen a member react to staff input with such focused attention. His pale eyes studied her face as if he were trying to solve a particularly complex equation. "You don't seem concerned about my reputation, Miss Calloway." "Your reputation is that you have high standards," Brenna replied evenly. "So do I. The difference is, I use mine to create excellence instead of tearing others down." The words hung between them like a challenge. Around the lobby, other staff members had begun their usual disappearing act, but Brenna remained perfectly calm, meeting Sterling's ice-blue gaze without flinching. "Interesting perspective," he murmured. "It's practical perspective, Mr. Ashworth. You want tomorrow night to be flawless. I want to deliver flawless service. Our goals align perfectly." Sterling straightened. "Decision made. Arrange everything exactly as you've described. Spare no expense, of course." He turned to leave, then paused, looking back over his shoulder. "Miss Calloway, what makes you think you can deliver what you promise?" Brenna smiled, the expression warming her green eyes with quiet confidence. "Because I've never made a promise I couldn't keep, and I'm not starting now." 20 minutes later, she'd confirmed Chef Anderson's availability, arranged the wine consultation, reserved the club's most elegant private dining room, and coordinated every detail from floral arrangements to background music. When Marcus approached her desk, he was shaking his head in amazement. "I watched that entire conversation, and I still don't believe it." "What don't you believe?" "He didn't try to humiliate you. not once. He actually listened to your suggestions and took them seriously. Brenner continued typing, organizing confirmations into a detailed timeline. Maybe he just needed someone to treat him like a competent adult instead of a ticking time bomb. But that's not how Sterling Ashworth works. He finds weakness and exploits it. That's his thing. Brenner paused, considering this. Then maybe his thing isn't working anymore. The next evening, Brenner arrived at the club early to personally oversee every detail of Sterling's dinner arrangements. She checked the table setting twice, tasted the wine selection, ensured the lighting was perfect, and confirmed the music would enhance conversation without overwhelming it. At 7:15, Sterling appeared in the doorway of the private dining room, surveying the scene with his characteristic attention to detail. His guests, 3 distinguished men and 1 elegant woman in her 50s, followed him inside, chatting quietly among themselves. Brenner watched from the hallway as the evening unfolded. The food was exceptional, the wine pairing flawless, and the conversation flowed smoothly around the beautifully appointed table. Sterling's business partner's wife, a woman who clearly intimidated most people, smiled genuinely as she complimented the orchid arrangements and asked about the wine selection. At 9:30, as the dinner concluded, Sterling emerged from the dining room and found Brenner waiting by the reception desk. "Adequate work, Miss Calloway," he said, his voice carrying that same crisp authority as always. "Perhaps you're not completely incompetent. High praise indeed, Mr. Ashworth?" Brenner replied smoothly. "I'll try to contain my overwhelming excitement." For the second time in a week, Sterling Ashworth smiled, a real smile that reached his ice-blue eyes and transformed his entire face. It lasted exactly 3 seconds, but in those 3 seconds, Brenner caught a glimpse of someone entirely different from the cold, cutting man who made staff members quit their jobs. As he walked toward the exit, Sterling paused near the door. "Miss Calloway?" "Yes, sir. My business partner's wife wants to know who arranged this evening. She says it was the most perfectly executed dinner party she's attended in Manhattan. Please tell her it was my pleasure to exceed her expectations." Sterling nodded once, then disappeared into the Manhattan night, leaving behind only the faint scent of expensive cologne and the most dangerous thing of all, a $500 tip that violated every club policy about appropriate gratuities. Brenner stared at the crisp bills on her desk, her heart beating faster than professional composure should allow. This wasn't just recognition of excellent service. This was acknowledgement of something deeper, something that had passed between them during their verbal exchanges, a recognition of equals meeting on intellectual ground. As she locked the tip in her desk drawer to return according to club policy, Brenner found herself wondering what would happen the next time Sterling Ashworth walked through those mahogany doors. And for the first time in her carefully controlled life, she realized she was actually looking forward to finding out. The next week passed with unusual quietness at the Sterling Club, but Brenner couldn't escape the feeling that she was waiting for something. Every time the heavy glass doors opened, her eyes lifted expectantly from her work, then returned to her computer screen with an odd mixture of relief and disappointment when the arriving member wasn't Sterling. She told herself their interactions meant nothing beyond professional courtesy. She'd returned his excessive tip to accounting with a memo about maintaining appropriate boundaries. She'd even made a point of declining 3 different invitations to coffee from perfectly nice men, reminding herself that dating wasn't a luxury she could afford while finishing her graduate degree and managing Indy's wedding preparations. But late at night, while reviewing her thesis notes on non-profit management and social equity, Brenner's mind would drift to ice-blue eyes and unexpected smiles. She'd catch herself wondering what Sterling Ashworth was really like beneath his carefully constructed armor of wealth and intimidation. On Wednesday evening, as autumn rain streaked the club's tall windows, Brenner sat alone at the reception desk organizing vendor contacts for Indy's wedding. The club was nearly empty. Just a few members reading newspapers in the library and the soft murmur of conversation from the bar area. Her phone buzzed with a text from Indy. "Wedding planning emergency. Call when you can." Brenna's stomach dropped. Emergency was not a word her sister used lightly. She stepped into the small office behind the reception area and dialed Indy's number. "What's wrong?" "Bree, the venue cancelled. Like, completely cancelled. Something about a double booking and a corporate event that's worth more money than our wedding." Brenna sank into the desk chair, her mind immediately shifting into crisis management mode. "When did they tell you this?" "An hour ago. 2 weeks before the wedding, and they're cancelling. The coordinator was so apologetic, but apparently the corporate client is paying triple what we're paying, and the venue owner just chose the money." "Okay," Brenna said, forcing her voice to remain calm while her heart raced. "We'll figure this out. I'll start making calls tonight. There has to be somewhere available. Bree, I've already tried calling 17 places. Everything that's remotely suitable is booked solid, or they want deposits we can't afford, or they need 3 months minimum notice. I don't know what we're going to do." The despair in Indy's voice hit Brenna like a physical blow. Her sister had been planning this wedding for 8 months, saving every penny from her job at the art gallery, dreaming about her perfect day with Nathan. Brenna had helped coordinate every detail, from the dress fittings to the menu tastings, watching Indy's face light up with happiness at each decision. "Hey," Brenna said firmly, "look at me, figuratively. We've gotten through worse than this. Remember? We're going to find a solution. I promise." "But what if we can't? What if we have to postpone everything? Nathan's family is flying in from California. My college friends have already arranged time off work. And the photographer, the flowers, the catering, everything is scheduled for 2 weeks from Saturday. Then everything will happen exactly as planned, just in a different location. Give me 48 hours, okay? I'm going to fix this." After hanging up, Brenna sat in the quiet office, staring at her notepad covered with wedding vendor contacts. She'd already stretched her savings to help cover wedding expenses, taken on extra shifts at the club, and carefully budgeted every detail. Finding a new venue with 2 weeks' notice would require either a miracle or the kind of connections that came with serious money. She was so absorbed in making a list of potential solutions that she didn't hear footsteps approaching the reception desk until a familiar voice cut through her concentration. "You seem unusually affected today, Miss Calloway. Are you incapable of performing your duties?" Brenna looked up to find Sterling Ashworth standing in the office doorway, his ice-blue eyes studying her with sharp attention. She hadn't heard him enter the club, hadn't seen him approach, a professional lapse that would have mortified her under normal circumstances. "Mr. Ashworth," she said, quickly closing her notepad and standing. "I wasn't expecting you this evening. How can I assist you?" Sterling didn't move from the doorway, his gaze taking in her carefully controlled expression and the tension she couldn't quite hide. "That didn't answer my question. I'm perfectly capable of performing my duties, sir. What do you need?" For a long moment, they stared at each other across the small office. Brenna had learned to read the club's members over 3 years of service, when they were angry, anxious, demanding, or dismissive. But Sterling's expression was something she'd never seen before. Genuine curiosity mixed with what looked almost like concern. "Family obligations require strategic thinking, not emotional reactions," he said finally. "Have you considered contractual remedies?" The question was so unexpected that Brenna answered before she could stop herself. "It's not a contract issue. It's a money issue. Someone offered more, so they broke their commitment." Sterling stepped fully into the office, his presence making the small space feel even smaller. "What type of venue? I should get back to the reception desk. Miss Calloway, what type of venue?" Something in his tone stopped her protest. "Wedding reception. 120 guests. My sister's getting married in 2 weeks. And the venue just cancelled for a corporate event with a bigger budget. Sterling's pale eyebrows drew together slightly. 2 weeks' notice for cancellation violates most standard hospitality contracts. Did she read the terms before signing? She read everything, but the cancellation clause allows it if they provide full refund plus damages, which amounts to about $300 compensation for ruining the most important day of her life. Sterling was quiet for several seconds, his ice-blue eyes studying Brenna's face with that same intense focus he'd shown during their dinner planning conversation. When he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its crisp authority. What kind of reception did she envision? The question was so far from Sterling's usual interactions that Brenna found herself answering honestly. Simple but elegant, string quartet for ceremony music, dinner and dancing for the reception. Nothing extravagant, just beautiful. She's been dreaming about this day since she was 16. And you've been helping coordinate everything. I've been coordinating everything, Brenna corrected gently. Indy's focused on school and work. Wedding planning is what big sisters do. Sterling nodded slowly, as if processing information that didn't quite fit his usual worldview. Family obligations, he murmured. Exactly. For another long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Sterling did something that shocked Brenna into complete silence. He pulled out his phone and started typing, "Mr. Ashworth, what are you—" "I know people," he said, without looking up from his screen. "Venue managers who owe favors. Give me your sister's contact information and the wedding date." "That's not necessary." "Miss Calloway." Sterling looked up from his phone, his ice-blue eyes holding an expression she couldn't identify. "Give me the information." His tone wasn't demanding or cruel. It was something far more dangerous. It was kind. And kindness from Sterling Ashworth felt like stepping onto uncertain ground after years of solid footing. Against every instinct that told her to maintain professional boundaries, Brenna found herself sharing Indy's phone number and wedding details. As Sterling typed the information into his phone, she studied his face, trying to understand what was happening between them. "Why would you help with this?" Sterling finished typing and looked at her directly, because family obligations shouldn't be destroyed by other people's greed. The simple statement hung in the air between them, carrying implications that neither of them seemed prepared to examine. When Sterling turned to leave the office, Brenna found her voice. "Mr. Ashworth, thank you." He paused in the doorway. "Not turning around. Don't thank me yet, Miss Calloway. Thank me when your sister has the wedding she deserves." As his footsteps faded across the marble lobby, Brenna sat back down at the desk, staring at her wedding planning notes with completely new eyes. For the first time since meeting Sterling Ashworth, she'd seen beneath his carefully maintained facade of cold authority, and what she'd found there was far more complicated and dangerous than she'd ever imagined. Tomorrow, she would probably convince herself that tonight's conversation was an aberration, a moment of weakness in Sterling's usually impenetrable armor. But right now, sitting alone in the quiet office, Brenna couldn't shake the feeling that everything had just changed in ways she wasn't prepared to understand. The call came at 7:30 the next morning, jolting Brenna from the first decent sleep she'd managed in days. "Bree, you're not going to believe this." Indy's voice practically vibrated with excitement through the phone. "Someone called me about the wedding venue situation." Brenna sat up in her small apartment bedroom, instantly alert. "Who called you?" "A woman named Victoria Chen, from the Meridian Gallery. She said she heard about our situation and wanted to offer their space for the reception." "Bree, I looked it up online. This place is incredible. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Hudson River, original hardwood floors, and they specialize in intimate wedding receptions." "That's wonderful, sweetheart, but we can't afford—" "That's the thing. She quoted a price that's actually less than what our cancelled venue was charging. Less, Bree. And she said they had a last-minute cancellation for exactly our date, so everything works perfectly." Brenna's mind immediately went to ice blue eyes and unexpected kindness. How did she hear about our situation? She said a mutual contact mentioned we were looking for a venue, someone who vouched for what did she call it? Our commitment to excellence and attention to detail. Brenna closed her eyes, feeling something shift in her chest that had nothing to do with relief about the venue. Sterling Ashworth had kept his word, but more than that, he'd done it quietly, without fanfare, without expecting recognition or gratitude. "Bree, are you there?" "I'm here. When can you see the space?" "This afternoon at 2. Victoria said she'd love to meet with both of us if you can get away from work." 3 hours later, Brenna stood in the Meridian Gallery, watching Indy's face light up like Christmas morning as Victoria Chen guided them through the elegant space. The venue was everything Indy had dreamed of, sophisticated without being pretentious, romantic without being overdone, and somehow more perfect than their original choice. "The catering kitchen is fully equipped," Victoria explained, her genuine warmth making the business discussion feel like conversation between friends. "And we work with several excellent vendors who can handle everything from floral arrangements to string quartets on short notice." "This is absolutely beautiful," Indy whispered, standing by the windows where afternoon sunlight painted golden rectangles across the polished floors. "Nathan is going to die when he sees this." As Victoria and Indy discussed final details, Brenna found herself wondering about the mysterious contact who'd made this miracle possible. Sterling had to have called in significant favors to arrange something this perfect on such short notice. The question was why. That evening, Brenna arrived at the Sterling Club 30 minutes early, hoping to catch Sterling before the usual evening rush of members. She'd rehearsed what she wanted to say, professional gratitude, acknowledgement of his assistance, and a clear understanding that this didn't change their working relationship. Instead, she found Marcus practically bouncing with nervous energy behind the reception desk. "Thank goodness you're here," he said without preamble. "Emergency in the Wellington suite. Mrs. Wellington's hosting some kind of crisis dinner for her book club, and apparently the usual catering staff all came down with food poisoning simultaneously." "How simultaneously?" Brenna asked, already reaching for her emergency vendor contacts. "Suspicious simultaneously, like they heard Mrs. Wellington was cooking again simultaneously." Brenna couldn't help smiling. Mrs. Wellington's enthusiasm for elaborate dinner parties was only matched by her complete inability to execute them without professional intervention. Last month's disaster had involved 3 fire alarms and the resignation of 2 catering assistants. What does she need? Dinner for 8 literary ladies who take their wine very seriously and their conversation even more seriously. She wants something that says sophisticated intellectual gathering, not desperate last-minute scrambling. Brenna was already dialing numbers, her mind organizing solutions with practiced efficiency. Within 20 minutes, she'd arranged emergency catering from Artisanal Affairs, secured wine pairings from the club's sommelier, and coordinated table service that would make Mrs. Wellington's book club feel like distinguished scholars rather than rescued dinner guests. "You're amazing at this," Marcus observed, watching her orchestrate the complex logistics with calm competence. "Like, scary amazing. How do you make impossible things happen so easily?" "Practice," Brenna replied, but her attention was divided. Through the club's tall windows, she could see Sterling's distinctive silhouette approaching the entrance. Her pulse quickened involuntarily, which was both unprofessional and ridiculous. When Sterling entered the lobby, his pale blue eyes found hers immediately, as if he'd been looking for her specifically. He approached the reception desk with his usual measured stride, but something in his expression seemed different, less guarded, more curious. "Miss Calloway," he said formally, then paused. "How did your sister's venue situation resolve?" The question was neutral enough, but Brenner caught the slight emphasis on resolve, as if he already knew the answer and was testing her response. Very well. Thank you for asking. She found a beautiful space that's actually better suited to her vision than the original venue. Sterling nodded slowly, his ice blue eyes studying her face. Sometimes setbacks lead to better outcomes. Sometimes they do, Brenner agreed carefully. Especially when people go out of their way to help solve problems they didn't create. The words hung between them like a delicate bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Marcus had suddenly found urgent paperwork that required his complete attention on the other side of the lobby, leaving them in relative privacy. Family obligations require strategic solutions, Sterling said quietly. I'm glad she found what she needed. The conversation felt layered with meanings Brenner couldn't quite pass. Sterling wasn't admitting to anything directly, but his phrasing suggested intimate knowledge of Indy's situation that he couldn't have gained through casual inquiry. Mr. Ashworth, she began, then stopped. What was she supposed to say? Thank you for using your influence to save my sister's wedding. Thank you for caring about people you've never met. Thank you for surprising me with unexpected kindness. Yes, Miss Calloway. The way he said her name, with careful pronunciation and something that almost sounded like warmth, made her forget whatever professional response she'd planned. I appreciate strategic solutions, she said finally. Especially ones that prioritize family happiness over bureaucratic convenience. Sterling's mouth curved into what might have been the beginning of a smile. Bureaucratic convenience rarely produces memorable experiences. No, Brenner agreed. It doesn't. For a moment that felt much longer than it actually was, they looked at each other across the mahogany reception desk. Brenner had the strangest sensation that they were having two completely different conversations, one about wedding venues and family obligations, and another about something much more personal and dangerous. Sterling broke the spell by glancing at his platinum watch. I should let you return to your work, of course. But as he turned to leave, Sterling paused. Miss Calloway, your sister is fortunate to have someone who fights so hard for her happiness. The comment was delivered in his usual crisp tone, but something in his ice blue eyes suggested deeper meaning. Before Brenner could respond, he was walking away, leaving her with more questions than answers, and the unsettling realization that Sterling Ashworth was far more complicated than she'd ever imagined. As the evening progressed, and the club filled with its usual distinguished clientele, Brenner found herself replaying their conversation. Every word, every pause, every fleeting expression that had crossed Sterling's aristocratic features. She told herself it was professional curiosity. Understanding difficult members was part of excellent service. But late that night, as she finally locked up the club and walked through Manhattan's quiet streets toward her apartment, Brenner couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted between them. Sterling's unexpected kindness had cracked open a door she'd never known existed, and she wasn't sure either of them was prepared for what might walk through it. The next morning brought autumn rain and the kind of grey Manhattan weather that made everyone move a little faster and speak a little quieter. Brenner emerged from the subway station near Columbia University, her leather portfolio tucked under her umbrella as she navigated puddles and hurried pedestrians toward her favorite coffee shop. She had 2 hours before her shift at the Sterling Club, just enough time to review her thesis notes and maybe make progress on the chapter about sustainable funding models for non-profit organizations. The coffee shop near campus had become her second office, a place where she could spread out research materials without judgment or interruption. Café Luna was exactly what a graduate student needed: strong coffee, comfortable seating, and the kind of ambient noise that somehow made concentration easier rather than harder. Brenner claimed her usual table by the window, ordered her usual medium coffee with oat milk, and settled in with her laptop and stack of journal articles. For 45 minutes, she immersed herself in research about innovative approaches to social service funding. Her thesis focused on creating sustainable financial models for organizations serving former foster children, young adults who aged out of the system without family support or institutional guidance. It was personal research, born from watching indies struggle with independence after their parents died, but it was also practical work that could actually change lives. She was so absorbed in an article about public-private partnerships that she didn't notice someone approaching her table until a familiar voice cut through her concentration. "Miss Calloway?" Brenner looked up to find Sterling Ashworth standing beside her table, holding a cup of black coffee and wearing an expression of genuine surprise. Outside the formal environment of the Sterling Club, he looked different, still impeccably dressed in a charcoal wool coat and navy scarf, but somehow more human. "Mr. Ashworth," she said, automatically closing her laptop. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." "Nor are you," Sterling replied, then paused. "May I ask what brings you to this particular establishment?" "Graduate school." Brenner gestured toward her stack of research materials. "I'm working on my thesis, and this place has the right combination of caffeine and quiet concentration." Sterling's pale blue eyes moved to her closed laptop, then to the journal articles spread across the small table. "What's your field of study?" "Non-profit management with a focus on social services," she answered, watching his face for signs of the dismissive reaction she'd grown accustomed to from wealthy club members who considered social work a hobby rather than a profession. Instead, Sterling's expression sharpened with what looked like genuine interest. "Specifically, what type of social services?" "Programs for young adults transitioning out of foster care," Brenner said, then found herself continuing, despite every professional instinct that told her to maintain appropriate boundaries. "Most people don't realize that foster children become legal adults at 18, whether they're ready or not. No family support, no financial safety net, no institutional guidance for college or career decisions. The statistics for homelessness, unemployment, and mental health challenges are significant." Sterling was quiet for several seconds, studying her face with the same intense focus he'd shown during their dinner planning conversation. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its usual crisp authority. "May I sit down?" The question was so unexpected that Brenner answered without thinking, "Of course." Sterling arranged himself in the small chair across from her, his long legs folding awkwardly beneath the tiny table. Up close, without the formal barrier of the reception desk between them, Brenner could see details she'd never noticed before. The way his platinum hair caught the light from the window, the small scar near his left temple, the fact that his ice-blue eyes held flecks of grey that made them seem less cold and more complicated. "Your thesis topic suggests personal experience with the foster care system," Sterling observed quietly. "Not directly," Brenner replied carefully. "But I've seen how difficult the transition to independence can be when young people don't have family support systems." Sterling nodded slowly, as if processing information that connected to something in his own experience. "What kind of sustainable funding models are you researching?" The question revealed knowledge of non-profit terminology that surprised Brenner. Most people thought non-profit work meant charity drives and good intentions. Sterling was asking about the complex business structures that made social programs actually function long-term. Hybrid models. Mostly, she explained, opening her laptop again. Combinations of government funding, corporate partnerships, and social enterprise revenue streams. Traditional grant-based funding is too unstable for programs that need to provide consistent support over multiple years. Sterling leaned forward slightly, his attention completely focused on her explanation. Social enterprise revenue streams. Like what, Brenner found herself warming to the topic, despite the surreal nature of discussing social justice with Manhattan's most notorious member. Training programs that generate consulting revenue, transitional housing that operates like sustainable real estate investment, job placement services that earn fees from partner employers. The idea is to create programs that serve vulnerable populations while generating enough revenue to maintain quality service without depending entirely on external funding. That's sophisticated thinking, Sterling said, and his tone carried none of the condescension she'd expected. Most non-profit organizations struggle with the tension between mission and sustainability. You sound like you have experience with non-profit structures. Some, Sterling replied, then paused as if deciding how much to reveal. My family's foundation works with several organizations that serve transitional populations. Transitional populations. The careful phrasing suggested knowledge of social service terminology while maintaining emotional distance from the human realities behind the clinical language. What kind of organizations? Brenner asked. Sterling hesitated, his pale blue eyes studying the coffee cup in his hands. Programs for young adults who need additional support during the transition to independence, educational assistance, job training, housing stability, the kind of comprehensive services you're describing in your thesis. There was something in his voice, a careful neutrality that suggested personal stakes beyond philanthropic interest. Brenner found herself looking at Sterling Ashworth with entirely new eyes, seeing not just the cold, cutting member who made staff quit their jobs, but someone who understood the complex challenges facing vulnerable young people. That's exactly what I'm researching, she said quietly. How to create programs that provide real support without creating dependency, that help people build sustainable independence rather than just surviving crisis to crisis. Sterling nodded, his expression thoughtful. It's delicate work. Too much structure can inhibit natural development, but too little support can lead to unfortunate outcomes. The phrase unfortunate outcomes carried weight that suggested Sterling knew exactly what those outcomes looked like. Homelessness, addiction, mental health crises, early pregnancy, criminal involvement, all the statistical probabilities that made foster care transition research so urgent and heartbreaking. For several minutes, they sat in comfortable silence, the ambient noise of the coffee shop creating a bubble of privacy around their small table. Brenner found herself studying Sterling's profile as he watched rain streak the window, noting the tension in his jaw and the way his fingers moved restlessly against his coffee cup. "Mr. Ashworth," she said finally, "can I ask you something?" Sterling turned back to her, eyebrows raised in question. "Why did you help with my sister's wedding venue?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. His pale blue eyes widened slightly, and for a moment he looked almost vulnerable, like someone who'd been caught revealing more than intended. Because family obligations shouldn't be destroyed by other people's greed, he said quietly, echoing his words from the night before. "But you don't know my sister. You don't know me, really. Why would you go out of your way to help strangers?" Sterling was quiet for a long time, his ice blue eyes studying her face as if trying to decide how much truth to reveal. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. "Because I know what it's like to have important things destroyed by other people's choices, and because—" Sterling paused, seeming to struggle with words that didn't come easily. "Because watching you fight for her happiness reminded me that some things are worth protecting." The admission hung between them like something fragile and dangerous. Brenner felt her heart rate increase, not from anxiety, but from something much more complicated, a recognition that Sterling Ashworth was not at all the person she'd thought he was. "Thank you," she said simply. Sterling nodded once, then glanced at his watch. "I should let you return to your thesis work." But as he stood to leave, Brenner found herself speaking without conscious decision. "Mr. Ashworth, if you're ever interested in discussing non-profit funding models further, I mean, from a business perspective, I'd welcome the input." Sterling paused, his hand on the back of his chair, and for the first time since she'd known him, his smile reached his eyes. "I would like that very much, Miss Calloway." As he walked away, Brenner sat staring at her research materials without seeing them, her mind replaying every word of their conversation. Sterling Ashworth was turning out to be full of surprises, and each surprise made her more curious about the man behind the carefully constructed facade. Outside, autumn rain continued to fall on Manhattan, but inside Café Luna, Brenner felt something entirely unexpected warming her from the inside out, the dangerous realization that she was beginning to care about Sterling Ashworth as a person, not just a difficult member who required professional management, and that, she thought, as she finally returned to her thesis notes, was going to complicate everything. 2 days later, Brenner was reorganizing vendor files when her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Venue secured, Saturday 2 p.m, if you're available to see the space before your sister's final walkthrough. SA." She stared at the message, her pulse quickening with a mixture of gratitude and something more complicated. Sterling had not only kept his promise, but was following up to ensure everything met expectations. The consideration behind the gesture felt more personal than professional courtesy. Before she could second-guess herself, Brenner typed back, "Yes, thank you." The response came immediately. "Meridian Gallery. I'll meet you there." Saturday afternoon found Brenner standing outside the Meridian Gallery, butterflies dancing in her stomach for reasons that had nothing to do with wedding planning. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see Sterling's tall figure moving through the elegant space, apparently examining details with his characteristic attention to perfection. He looked up as she approached the entrance, moving to open the door before she could reach for the handle. "Miss Calloway," he said formally, but his pale blue eyes held warmth that contradicted his crisp tone. "Thank you for coming." "Thank you for arranging this," Brenner replied, stepping into the gallery's soaring main space. "It's even more beautiful than I remembered." Sterling guided her through the venue with the efficiency of someone accustomed to evaluating spaces for important events. He pointed out practical considerations she hadn't thought to notice. Optimal lighting for photographs, acoustics for speech and music, traffic flow for guests moving between ceremony and reception areas. "Your sister mentioned wanting string quartet music for the ceremony," Sterling said, as they paused by the windows overlooking the Hudson River. "This alcove provides natural acoustic enhancement without requiring additional sound equipment." Brenner watched him gesture toward architectural features that affected sound quality, his hands moving with unconscious grace as he explained technical details. "How do you know so much about event planning?" Sterling paused, seeming to consider his answer carefully. "I've attended enough poorly planned events to recognize what makes the difference between adequate and exceptional, but this level of detail suggested more than passive observation." Sterling was discussing load-bearing walls, electrical capacity, and catering workflow with the expertise of someone who'd been involved in complex event logistics. "Have you planned events yourself?" Brenner asked. "Some," Sterling replied, then seemed to catch himself revealing more than intended. "Foundation fundraisers require attention to detail." "Of course," Brenner said, though she suspected there was more to the story. Sterling's knowledge seemed too practical, too specific to come from simply writing checks for charity galas. They continued through the space, Sterling pointing out features that would enhance Indy's vision for simple elegance. When they reached the small staging area where the string quartet would perform, he stopped and turned to face her directly. "Miss Calloway, I want to be clear about something. Yes, this venue arrangement comes with no expectations or obligations. Your sister's wedding should be perfect because she deserves it to be perfect, not because of any consideration for me. The careful phrasing suggested Sterling was aware of the potential implications of accepting such a significant favor from a wealthy club member. Brenner appreciated his directness in addressing what could have been an uncomfortable power dynamic. "I understand," she said, "but I also want to be clear about something. This kindness won't be forgotten, regardless of any other considerations." Sterling's ice-blue eyes held hers for a moment that felt much longer than it actually was. Something passed between them, an acknowledgement of mutual respect and growing, something that neither seemed ready to name. The spell was broken when Brenner's phone buzzed with a text from Indy. "Running 10 minutes late. Is the space as amazing as I remember?" She showed Sterling the message, and his mouth curved into what was becoming a familiar, almost smile. "Your sister sounds excited. She is. This wedding means everything to her, and for a while there it seemed like everything was falling apart. But it didn't fall apart," Sterling observed quietly. "Sometimes circumstances force us toward better outcomes than we originally planned." Brenner studied his profile as he looked out over the river, noting the thoughtful expression that softened his usually sharp features. "Do you really believe that setbacks can lead to something better?" Sterling was quiet for several seconds, his pale blue eyes distant with what looked like personal memory. "I believe that sometimes we have to lose what we thought we wanted to discover what we actually need." The statement carried implications that extended far beyond wedding venue logistics. Before Brenner could respond, the gallery's entrance chimed with Indy's arrival, her voice calling excitedly across the space. "Bree, this place is absolutely magical." As Indy rushed toward them, her face glowing with happiness, Sterling stepped back slightly, returning to his more formal demeanor. But when Indy reached them and Brenner made introductions, something unexpected happened. "Mr. Ashworth," Indy said, extending her hand with natural warmth. "Thank you so much for helping us find this place. Brenner told me you were instrumental in making this happen." Sterling accepted her handshake with uncharacteristic gentleness, his usual cold authority replaced by something almost protective. "Your sister is very dedicated to your happiness," he said simply. "I was glad to assist with the logistics." For the next hour, Brenner watched Sterling interact with Indy with a careful kindness that revealed yet another facet of his complex personality. He answered her questions about the venue's history, offered practical suggestions about setup logistics, and even smiled genuinely when Indy showed him photos of her dress and described her vision for the ceremony. When they finally parted ways outside the gallery, Indy hugged Brenner with tears in her eyes. "He's not what I expected," she whispered. "From everything you'd told me about difficult club members, I thought he'd be different. Different how? I don't know. Cold, maybe? Intimidating? But he was so careful with everything, like he really wanted this to be perfect for us." As Indy headed home to continue wedding preparations, Brenner found herself walking slowly through Manhattan's autumn afternoon, thinking about Sterling's unexpected gentleness with her sister. The man who made experienced professionals quit their jobs had spent his Saturday ensuring that a young woman he'd never met would have the wedding of her dreams. That night, as she sat in her small apartment reviewing the final wedding timeline, Brenner's phone buzzed with another message from Sterling. "Your sister's happiness is evident. The venue will serve her vision well." For a long time, Brenner stared at the message, trying to understand the man behind the carefully chosen words. Sterling Ashworth was proving to be nothing like the cold, cruel member she'd originally encountered. Instead, he was revealing himself to be someone capable of extraordinary kindness, someone who understood the importance of protecting other people's happiness, even when he gained nothing from the effort. And that realization, Brenner thought, as she finally turned off her phone and tried to focus on wedding details, was becoming more dangerous to her carefully controlled life than she'd ever imagined possible. The phone call came at 6 a.m. on Monday morning, jarring Brenna from deep sleep with the insistent buzzing that meant emergency. She fumbled for her phone, instantly alert when she saw Sterling's name on the screen. "Miss Calloway," his voice was crisp with controlled urgency, "I need you to know that my father may contact you or your sister directly." Brenna sat up, immediately on guard. "Why would your father contact us? Because he's discovered my involvement in your sister's venue arrangements, and he disapproves of what he considers inappropriate personal investment in staff situations." The careful phrasing couldn't disguise the tension in Sterling's voice. Brenna found herself imagining a conversation between father and son that had probably involved words like boundaries and professional distance, and possibly reputation management. What kind of contact should we expect? Sterling was quiet for several seconds. He may suggest that the venue arrangement comes with expectations that weren't clearly communicated. He may imply that accepting such assistance creates obligations. Brenna felt anger flash through her chest. "Are you telling me your father thinks I accepted help with my sister's wedding in exchange for some kind of personal consideration?" "I'm telling you that my father operates from assumptions about human motivation that reflect his own experience rather than current reality." The diplomatic answer didn't quite hide Sterling's frustration with whatever conversation had prompted this early morning warning call. Brenna found herself wondering about family dynamics that could produce such careful distance between father and son. "Mr. Ashworth," she said firmly, "if your father contacts me or my sister, I'll handle the conversation appropriately. We accepted help with venue logistics, nothing more. Anyone who suggests otherwise will be corrected clearly and directly." Sterling was quiet again, and when he spoke, his voice carried something that sounded almost like relief. "Thank you, Miss Calloway. I wanted you to be prepared for the possibility. Is there anything else I should know?" "Just that—" Sterling paused, seeming to struggle with words that didn't come easily. "Just that my assistance with your sister's wedding reflects my respect for your dedication to her happiness. Nothing more and nothing less." "I understand," Brenna said softly. "And Mr. Ashworth, thank you for the warning." After hanging up, Brenna sat in her quiet apartment, watching Manhattan morning light filter through her small windows. The conversation had revealed layers of complexity in Sterling's world that she'd never considered: family pressures, assumptions about motivation, and the kind of scrutiny that apparently accompanied even simple acts of kindness when your last name carried enough weight to move mountains. She was still thinking about family dynamics and reputation management when she arrived at the Sterling Club 2 hours later. Marcus took one look at her face and immediately poured her a cup of the premium coffee they kept behind the reception desk for emergency situations. "You look like someone who's been having deep thoughts at inappropriate hours," he observed. "Something like that," Brenna replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Has anyone been asking questions about venue arrangements or member assistance with staff situations?" Marcus's eyebrows rose. "What kind of questions? The kind that imply personal favors and professional boundary issues?" "Oh, those kind of questions." Marcus lowered his voice. "Actually, yes. Mr. Harrison Ashworth called yesterday afternoon asking about his son's recent interactions with concierge staff. Very specific questions about time frames and types of assistance provided." Harrison Ashworth, Sterling's father. The conversation Sterling had warned her about was apparently already in progress. "What did you tell him?" "The truth. That his son has been unfailingly professional in all interactions, that any assistance provided was well within normal concierge service parameters, and that Sterling has never requested anything inappropriate or unusual." Marcus paused, studying Brenna's face. "Should I have said something different?" "No, You said exactly the right thing. I'm just trying to understand why anyone would be concerned about normal member services. Because Harrison Ashworth doesn't believe in normal anything, Marcus replied grimly. That man thinks every human interaction is a chess move with hidden strategy. He probably can't imagine his son helping someone without calculating what he gains from it. The assessment painted a picture of family dynamics that explained a lot about Sterling's careful emotional distance. Growing up with a father who viewed kindness as strategic manipulation would certainly teach someone to hide genuine impulses behind protective armor. The morning passed quietly, with usual member requests and routine administrative tasks. But at 11:30, the club's main telephone rang with the distinctive tone that meant external call rather than internal extension. The Sterling Club, Brenner answered with practiced professionalism. "This is Brenner Calloway. How may I assist you, Miss Calloway?" The voice was crisp with authority that felt familiar but distinctly colder than Sterling's usual tone. "This is Harrison Ashworth. I believe we need to have a conversation." "Of course, Mr. Ashworth. How can I help you? I understand my son has involved himself in your personal affairs, specifically assistance with wedding venue arrangements that goes well beyond normal concierge services." Brenner felt her spine straighten with protective instincts that had served her well during years of advocating for Indy's needs. Your son provided contact information for a venue that had experienced a last-minute cancellation. The assistance was professional and appropriate. "Miss Calloway," Harrison's voice carried the kind of patient condescension that suggested he was accustomed to people accepting his version of reality without question. "My son doesn't provide personal assistance to staff members without expecting something in return. I'm calling to clarify what understanding exists between you regarding compensation for his intervention." The implication hit Brenner like cold water, shocking in its assumptions about her character and Sterling's motivations. For several seconds, she was too angry to speak clearly. "Mr. Ashworth," she said finally, her voice deadly calm, "there is no understanding between your son and myself beyond professional courtesy. He provided venue contact information when he learned about a last-minute cancellation that affected my family. No compensation was requested, offered, or expected. My son doesn't involve himself in staff personal situations out of altruism, Miss Calloway. If you're operating under that assumption, you may find yourself disappointed when reality becomes apparent." The conversation was revealing more about Harrison Ashworth's worldview than about Sterling's motivations, but Brenner found herself wondering what kind of family environment had taught Sterling to hide genuine kindness behind emotional walls. "Mr. Ashworth, with all due respect, your assumptions about human motivation may not reflect your son's actual character. Perhaps you should have this conversation with him directly, rather than making implications about staff integrity." There was silence on the other end of the line, as if Harrison wasn't accustomed to being challenged by employees of any kind. "Miss Calloway," he said finally, his voice carrying a warning edge, "I hope for your sake that your confidence in my son's motivations proves justified. Good day." The line went dead, leaving Brenner staring at the phone with a mixture of anger and sadness. Harrison Ashworth's call had revealed a lot about family dynamics that shaped Sterling's careful emotional distance. Growing up with a father who couldn't imagine altruistic behavior would certainly explain why Sterling seemed surprised by simple human kindness. When Sterling appeared at the reception desk 3 hours later, Brenner could see tension in the rigid line of his shoulders and the careful neutrality of his expression. "Miss Calloway," he said formally, "I understand my father contacted you this morning. He did. We had an illuminating conversation about human motivation and professional boundaries." Sterling's ice-blue eyes studied her face, searching for signs of damage or discomfort. "I apologize for his implications. My father operates from assumptions that don't reflect current reality." The careful phrasing suggested Sterling was as trapped by family expectations as she'd suspected. Brenna found herself wanting to reassure him that Harrison's cynicism hadn't contaminated her understanding of his genuine kindness. "Mr. Ashworth, your father's assumptions say more about his experience than about your character. Nothing he suggested changed my understanding of our interactions." Sterling's tension seemed to ease slightly, though his expression remained carefully controlled. "Nevertheless, I regret that you were subjected to questions about motivations and expectations. I've handled more difficult conversations," Brenna replied gently. "Though I admit, I felt sorry for anyone who's learned to view kindness as manipulation." Something shifted in Sterling's ice-blue eyes, surprise, perhaps, or recognition that she'd understood the real tragedy of Harrison's worldview. "Miss Calloway," he said quietly, "thank you for understanding the complexities of family expectations." The phrase carried weight beyond its simple words, acknowledging family pressures that shaped Sterling's careful emotional distance, while expressing gratitude for her refusal to accept his father's cynical assumptions. For several moments, they looked at each other across the mahogany reception desk, and Brenna had the strange sensation that Sterling was seeing her with new eyes. Not just as competent staff who'd handled a difficult situation professionally, but as someone who'd chosen to defend his character when it would have been easier to accept his father's implications and maintain safe, emotional distance. "Mr. Ashworth," she said finally, "your father's concern about expectations and obligations, is there any truth to his warning that kindness from your family usually comes with hidden costs?" Sterling was quiet for a long time, his pale blue eyes distant with what looked like painful memory. "His family's kindness typically does carry hidden costs," he said finally. "But Miss Calloway, my assistance with your sister's venue was personal kindness, not family obligation. The distinction matters." The admission hung between them like something fragile and important. Personal kindness from Sterling Ashworth. Kindness that came from his own heart, rather than family manipulation or strategic calculation. The distinction did matter, more than Brenna was ready to examine. "Thank you for clarifying that," she said softly. Sterling nodded once, then glanced around the lobby, as if suddenly remembering where they were and who might be observing their conversation. "I should let you return to your work," he said, but his tone suggested reluctance to end the conversation. "Of course." But as he turned to leave, Sterling paused, looking back with an expression that seemed almost vulnerable. "Miss Calloway, I hope my father's implications haven't made our professional interactions more complicated than necessary." "Not more complicated," Brenna replied carefully. "Just more clear." Sterling studied her face for several seconds, then nodded slowly. "Clear can be dangerous, Miss Calloway." The warning was delivered quietly, but it carried implications that made Brenna's heart rate increase. Clear meant acknowledging the growing personal connection between them. Clear meant recognizing that Sterling's kindness was becoming something more significant than professional courtesy. Clear meant admitting that her own feelings were developing in directions that professional boundaries should prevent. As Sterling walked away, Brenna found herself touching the silver frame on her desk, the photo of her parents on their wedding day. They'd built their marriage on honesty and mutual respect, but they'd also endured the kind of family pressure that could destroy relationships if partners didn't stand together against external judgment. For the first time since meeting Sterling Ashworth, Brenna allowed herself to wonder what would happen if their careful professional distance continued to evolve into something more personal and dangerous. And for the first time in her carefully controlled life, she wasn't sure whether the possibility excited or terrified her more. That evening, as she prepared for Indy's final dress fitting, Brenna's phone buzzed with a message from Sterling. "Your integrity under pressure was noted and appreciated. Thank you for defending character over assumption." She stared at the message for a long time, recognizing it as something more significant than gratitude for professional discretion. Sterling was acknowledging that she'd chosen to believe in his genuine kindness, despite his father's warnings about hidden motivations. He was thanking her for seeing him as capable of authentic goodness, rather than accepting cynical assumptions about his character. And that, Brenna thought as she finally replied with simple, "You're welcome," was exactly the kind of dangerous emotional territory she'd spent years learning to avoid. The week leading up to Indy's wedding passed in a blur of final preparations, last-minute vendor confirmations, and the kind of controlled chaos that accompanied any major family celebration. Brenna found herself managing details with mechanical efficiency while her mind remained occupied with questions about Sterling Ashworth and the growing complexity of their interactions. She hadn't seen him at the club since their conversation about his father's implications. Part of her felt relieved by the return to normal routine, but a larger part found herself watching the lobby entrance with anticipation that had nothing to do with professional duty. On Wednesday evening, as she reviewed the final wedding timeline for what felt like the 100th time, her phone rang with Indy's number. "Bree, you need to see the venue one more time before Saturday." Indy's voice bubbled with excitement. "Victoria wants to do a final walkthrough tomorrow after work to make sure everything's perfect for the setup on Friday." "That sounds wise," Brenna replied. "What time works for you?" 6:30. "I know you usually work until 6, so I thought we could meet there and grab dinner afterward to celebrate surviving the wedding planning process." The next evening found Brenna approaching the Meridian Gallery as autumn sunset painted the Hudson River in shades of gold and amber. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see Indy and Victoria Chen moving through the space. Their animated conversation suggesting final details were falling into place perfectly. But as Brenna reached for the entrance door, she noticed another figure in the gallery's main space, Sterling's unmistakable silhouette by the windows overlooking the river. Her pulse quickened with surprise and something more complicated. When she entered the gallery, Victoria looked up with a warm smile. "Brenna, perfect timing. I was just showing Indy how the lighting will look during your ceremony time on Saturday. It's absolutely magical," Indy said, practically glowing with happiness. Mr. Ashworth was explaining how the sunset will provide natural backlighting for the string quartet performance. Sterling turned from the windows, his ice-blue eyes meeting Brenna's with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Miss Calloway," he said formally, "I hope you don't mind my presence. I wanted to ensure the final details met expectations." "Of course not," Brenna replied, though her heart was beating faster than the situation warranted. "It's thoughtful of you to follow up." For the next hour, they moved through the space together, Victoria explaining logistics, while Sterling offered practical suggestions born from obvious experience with complex event coordination. Brenna found herself watching him interact with Indy and Victoria with the same careful kindness he'd shown during their previous meeting. Attentive without being overwhelming, helpful without being controlling. When Victoria excused herself to check final catering arrangements, Indy immediately turned to Sterling with characteristic directness. "Mr. Ashworth, I want you to know how much this means to us. Not just the venue, but the way you've made sure everything is perfect. Bree told me you didn't have to help, but you chose to anyway." Sterling's expression softened in a way that made him look younger and less guarded. "Your sister's dedication to your happiness is remarkable, Miss Calloway. I was honored to assist with the logistics." "She's always been like that," Indy replied, glancing at Brenna with obvious affection. "Taking care of everyone else, making sure everything works out perfectly, never really thinking about what she wants for herself." The observation hung in the air with unexpected weight. Brenna felt heat rise in her cheeks, uncomfortable with being discussed as if she weren't standing right there. "Indy," she began, but Sterling spoke first. "Dedication to family happiness is admirable," he said quietly. his pale blue eyes holding Brenna's gaze. Though sometimes people who take care of everyone else forget to consider their own needs. The comment felt personal in a way that had nothing to do with wedding planning. Brenna found herself unable to look away from Sterling's ice-blue eyes, caught in a moment of recognition that felt dangerously intimate. "Exactly," Indy said, apparently oblivious to the undercurrent of tension between her sister and Sterling. "Breeze spent years making sure I had everything I needed for college and career, and now this wedding. But when's the last time she did something just because it made her happy?" The question landed with uncomfortable accuracy. When was the last time Brenna had pursued something simply because it brought her joy, rather than because it served someone else's needs or advanced someone else's goals? "I'm happy when the people I love are happy," Brenna said carefully. "That's not the same thing," Sterling replied, his voice gentle but firm. "Personal happiness and reflected happiness serve different needs." "How would you know?" The question escaped before Brenna could stop herself, and she immediately regretted its challenging tone. But Sterling didn't seem offended. Instead, he smiled with what looked like rueful self-awareness. "Because I've spent years confusing professional success with personal satisfaction," he said quietly. "The distinction becomes clear when you realize that achieving everything you thought you wanted still leaves you feeling incomplete." The admission was so honest and unexpected that Brenna felt something shift in her chest. Sterling Ashworth, heir to billions, master of Manhattan's business elite, feared by grown professionals, was acknowledging that success hadn't brought him happiness. When Victoria returned with final catering confirmations, the moment of intimate conversation dissolved into practical wedding logistics. But as they prepared to leave the gallery, Sterling approached Brenna with careful formality. "Miss Calloway, may I have a word?" Indy was already heading toward the exit, chattering with Victoria about final timeline details, leaving Brenna and Sterling in relative privacy by the river-facing windows. "Thank you for allowing me to be part of finalizing these arrangements," Sterling said. "Your sister's happiness is evident, and that reflects well on your care for her dreams." "She deserves a perfect wedding," Brenna replied. "You've helped make that possible." Sterling was quiet for several seconds, his ice-blue eyes studying her face in the soft gallery lighting. "Miss Calloway, your sister mentioned that you rarely pursue things simply for your own happiness. Is that accurate?" The personal question caught Brenna off guard. "Why do you ask?" "Because you've spent considerable energy ensuring other people's dreams come true," Sterling said quietly. "It seems appropriate to wonder about your own dreams." The conversation was moving into territory that felt too intimate for their professional relationship. But Brenna found herself answering honestly anyway. "My dreams involve making sure the people I love are safe and happy and able to pursue their own goals without obstacles I could have prevented." "And what about dreams that exist purely for your own fulfillment?" Brenna considered the question, recognizing its deeper implications. "Those feel selfish when other people need practical support, or perhaps they feel dangerous," Sterling suggested gently, "because pursuing personal happiness requires admitting what you actually want rather than what you think you should want." The observation was so accurate that Brenna felt exposed, as if Sterling had identified something she'd been hiding even from herself. Did she avoid pursuing personal happiness because it felt selfish, or because acknowledging her own desires meant risking disappointment when they proved impossible to achieve? "Mr. Ashworth," she said carefully, "this conversation seems to be moving beyond wedding logistics." Sterling nodded slowly, his expression serious. "Yes, it does. And perhaps that's exactly what makes it dangerous." The word dangerous hung between them like a warning and an invitation simultaneously. Dangerous because personal conversations between them violated every professional boundary Brenna had spent years maintaining. Dangerous because Sterling was revealing depth and vulnerability that made him infinitely more attractive than his cold, cutting public persona. Dangerous because Brenner was beginning to care about him in ways that professional relationships should prevent. "I should catch up with my sister," Brenner said finally, though she made no move toward the exit. "Yes," Sterling agreed, though he also remained exactly where he was. "Miss Calloway, yes, Saturday should be beautiful for your sister's wedding. She's fortunate to have someone who fights so hard for her happiness. Thank you." But as they finally walked toward the gallery entrance, Brenner caught Sterling's reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows and saw an expression of longing that matched something she'd been trying to ignore in her own heart. The realization that Sterling Ashworth was becoming personally important to her was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Saturday would be Indy's perfect wedding day, made possible partly through Sterling's unexpected kindness. But Brenner was beginning to suspect that after Saturday, she and Sterling would have to confront whatever was growing between them, the dangerous possibility that their professional courtesy was evolving into something that could change both their carefully controlled lives forever. 2 weeks had passed since Indy's perfect wedding. 2 weeks since Brenner had watched her sister dance with Nathan under string lights at the Meridian Gallery, surrounded by family and friends who kept commenting on how magical the venue was, how everything had worked out better than originally planned. 2 weeks since she'd last seen Sterling Ashworth. Brenner pushed through the revolving door of the small non-profit office where she now worked 3 days a week, juggling this position with her 2 other part-time jobs since leaving the Sterling Club. The pay was a fraction of what she'd earned as senior concierge, but the work felt meaningful in ways that luxury hospitality never had. Here, she helped coordinate services for young adults transitioning out of foster care, the exact population her graduate thesis focused on. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd finally found work that aligned perfectly with her academic passions, but at the cost of financial stability that left her eating ramen for dinner and walking 40 blocks to save subway fare. Her phone buzzed as she settled at her desk. Zara's name appeared on the screen with a text that made her stomach drop. "Bree, call me. Now. It's about the Sterling thing." The Sterling thing. For 2 weeks, Brenner had refused to discuss Sterling Ashworth with anyone, including her best friend, who'd been asking increasingly pointed questions about why she'd left her prestigious job so suddenly after her sister's successful wedding. Brenner dialed Zara's number, steeling herself for whatever revelation had prompted the urgent message. "You need to see something," Zara said without preamble. "Can you meet me for coffee? Like, right now, I'm at work." "Bree, this is about Sterling Ashworth and the non-profit you're working for. Trust me, you need to see this." An hour later, Brenner sat across from Zara at a small coffee shop in Brooklyn, staring at a printed document that made her blood run cold. "Children's Future Foundation," Zara said quietly. "Sterling Ashworth serves as chairman of the board. Has for 3 years. They're the primary funding source for New Horizons Youth Services, the non-profit where you now work." Brenner studied the annual report, her hands trembling slightly as she processed the implications. Sterling hadn't just helped with Indy's wedding venue. He'd been anonymously funding her new workplace, which meant he'd known exactly where she'd end up when she left the Sterling Club. He'd essentially orchestrated her entire career transition. "There's more," Zara continued gently. "New Horizons received a substantial grant increase the week after Indy's wedding, enough to expand their transitional housing program and hire additional staff. The timing seems significant." Brenner felt something crack inside her chest, not her heart breaking, but her trust in her own judgment shattering completely. She'd thought Sterling's kindness was genuine, thought his help with the wedding venue was simple human decency. Instead, he'd been pulling strings behind the scenes, manipulating her life with the same casual power he used to destroy difficult staff members. "How did you find this?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "I have a friend who works in non-profit administration." When you mentioned Sterling's name in connection with your job change, she got curious and started researching foundation connections. Bree, this is extensive. He's been involved in youth services funding for years, specifically programs that serve former foster children. Former foster children. The demographic that included people like Brenner, who'd essentially raised a younger sibling after their parents died. Sterling had known exactly which emotional buttons to push, which causes would matter to her personally. The wedding venue assistance hadn't been random kindness. It had been strategic manipulation, designed to make her trust him, care about him, maybe even fall in love with him. "I have to go," Brenner said, standing abruptly. "Bree, wait. Maybe there's an explanation." "The explanation is that I was played by someone who's extremely good at getting what he wants," Brenner replied, her voice hollow with betrayal. "The question is what he wanted from me." But as she walked through Brooklyn's quiet streets toward the subway station, Brenner already knew the answer. Sterling had wanted her trust, her gratitude, her growing feelings that she'd been too naive to recognize as manipulation rather than genuine connection. He'd succeeded perfectly, and she'd been foolish enough to defend his character to his own father. Her phone rang as she reached the subway entrance. Sterling's name on the screen made her heart race with anger rather than anticipation. "Miss Calloway," his familiar voice carried the same careful formality as always. "I was hoping we might speak, perhaps over dinner this evening." "I think we need to speak right now," Brenner replied, her voice deadly calm. "Are you available to meet?" Sterling paused, apparently surprised by her directness. "Of course. Where would you prefer?" "Café Luna. 20 minutes. I'll be there." The coffee shop, where they'd first talked about her thesis research, seemed fitting for their final conversation. Brenner arrived early, claiming the same table by the window where Sterling had surprised her with knowledge of non-profit funding structures. Now she understood that his expertise hadn't come from philanthropic interest. It had come from years of practice in strategic manipulation. Sterling appeared exactly 20 minutes later, his platinum hair catching afternoon light as he scanned the cafe for her location. When his ice-blue eyes found hers, something in her expression must have warned him that this wasn't a social meeting. His usual confident stride faltered slightly as he approached her table. "Miss Calloway," he said, settling into the chair across from her with uncharacteristic caution, "you sounded concerned on the phone." "Concerned," Brenner repeated, placing the Children's Future Foundation annual report on the small table between them. "That's one word for it." Sterling's face went completely still as he recognized the document. For several seconds, he stared at the printed pages without speaking, and Brenner watched him calculate exactly how much she'd discovered about his behind-the-scenes manipulation. "I see you've been researching foundation connections," he said finally. "I've been researching the truth about your kindness," Brenner corrected, her voice carrying ice that would have made Harrison Ashworth proud. "Tell me, Mr. Ashworth, how long have you known that New Horizons Youth Services was going to offer me a position?" Sterling's pale blue eyes met hers directly, and she saw something that looked almost like relief mixed with resignation. "Since 2 days after your sister's wedding venue was confirmed, Victoria Chen serves on their advisory board and mentioned their need for someone with your experience and academic background. So, you arranged my entire career transition, my new job, the convenient timing, the salary that happens to be exactly what someone with my qualifications should earn in non-profit work. All of it orchestrated by the same person who made grown men quit their jobs rather than endure his attention." Sterling was quiet for a long moment, his fingers moving restlessly against his coffee cup in the same pattern she'd noticed during their first conversation at this table. When he spoke, his voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. "Yes," he said simply. "I arranged it." The admission hit Brenner like physical blow, even though she'd already known the truth. Hearing Sterling confirm that their entire relationship had been built on manipulation made her feel naive and stupid and completely powerless against someone with infinite resources and strategic intelligence. "Why?" she asked, proud that her voice remained steady despite the chaos in her chest. Sterling looked out the cafe window for several seconds, watching autumn rain begin to streak the glass. When he turned back to her, his ice-blue eyes held something that looked like genuine pain. "Because I wanted to see you succeed in work that matched your passion and intelligence. Because watching you waste your talents managing rich people's trivial problems felt like criminal negligence. Because—" Sterling paused, seeming to struggle with words that didn't come easily. "Because I care about your happiness more than I care about maintaining appropriate boundaries." The words should have felt like a romantic declaration, but instead they felt like another layer of manipulation. How was she supposed to trust anything Sterling said when he'd been controlling her circumstances for weeks without her knowledge? "You care about my happiness," Brenner repeated slowly. "So you decided to manage my entire life like I'm one of your business acquisitions. That's not—" "It's exactly that," Brenner interrupted, her careful composure finally cracking. "You saw something you wanted, my trust, my gratitude, maybe my feelings, and you used your money and influence to orchestrate circumstances that would give you access to it, just like you used your connections to save Indy's wedding, not out of kindness, but as an investment in making me care about you." Sterling's face had gone pale, but he didn't deny her accusations. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his voice carrying desperate honesty. "Miss Calloway, Brenner, everything I did was because I'm falling in love with you, and I wanted to give you opportunities that matched your worth." The words hung between them like something beautiful and terrible. Sterling Ashworth was in love with her. The confession should have been everything she'd secretly hoped to hear during those dangerous moments when she'd imagined what might grow between them. Instead, it felt like the cruelest manipulation of all. "You're falling in love with me," she said quietly, "so you decided to control my life to prove it. I decided to remove obstacles that were preventing you from achieving your potential. Without asking if I wanted those obstacles removed, without giving me the choice to succeed or fail based on my own efforts. You turned my entire life into your personal charity case." Sterling's ice-blue eyes flashed with something that looked like frustration. "Your talents were being wasted in hospitality work that didn't challenge your intelligence or advance your career goals. The non-profit position is perfect for your academic background and personal interests. And it never occurred to you that I might want to earn that position myself, that taking a job you arranged makes every achievement feel tainted by your influence." Sterling stared at her across the small table, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked genuinely lost. "I thought I was helping. You thought you were managing," Brenner corrected. "Just like you managed Indy's wedding venue, my job transition, probably my rent and grocery bills, if I dig deep enough into the funding sources. You've turned me into your personal project, and you call it love. That's not what this is." "Then what is it?" "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like someone with unlimited resources decided to play puppet master with my life and call it romance when I started dancing to the strings." Sterling was quiet for a long time, his pale blue eyes studying her face as if he were seeing her clearly for the first time. When he spoke again, his voice carried something that sounded like terrible recognition. "You're right," he said quietly. "I did exactly what my father would do, used money and influence to control circumstances rather than trusting you to make your own choices. I told myself it was love, but it was something else. Something that had more to do with my need to feel useful than your need for assistance. The admission should have felt like vindication, but instead it felt like watching something precious break beyond repair." Sterling was acknowledging that his feelings had led him to reproduce the same controlling behavior he'd learned from Harrison Ashworth. The recognition in his voice suggested he understood exactly how completely he'd violated her trust and autonomy. "Mr. Ashworth," Brenner said gently, because despite everything, she couldn't bring herself to be cruel to someone who was clearly devastated by his own recognition of wrongdoing. "I believe that you care about me. I even believe that your intentions were good. But I can't build a relationship with someone who thinks love means managing my choices instead of respecting them." Sterling nodded slowly, his ice-blue eyes holding hers with painful directness. "I understand," he said quietly. "And Miss Calloway, Brenner, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for manipulating circumstances you should have controlled. I'm sorry for making your achievements feel tainted by my interference. I'm sorry for loving you badly instead of loving you well." The apology was everything she could have wanted, and nothing that could repair the damage between them. Sterling understood exactly what he'd done wrong, which somehow made it worse than if he'd been oblivious to his manipulation. "I need to go," Brenner said, standing from the small table. Sterling remained seated, watching her gather her jacket and purse with an expression of complete defeat. As she turned to leave, his voice stopped her. "Brenner." She looked back, noting the way he said her first name like something precious and lost. "I love you enough to let you go," he said quietly, "and you love me enough to walk away rather than accept a relationship built on manipulation. That's exactly why this can't work. And it's exactly why you deserve better than what I've given you." The words echoed her own assessment with such accuracy that Brenner felt tears threaten for the first time since discovering the truth about her job. Sterling loved her enough to recognize that his love had been possessive rather than respectful. She loved him enough to refuse a relationship that required her to accept diminished autonomy in exchange for financial security and career advancement. "Goodbye, Mr. Ashworth," she said softly. As she walked away from Café Luna and toward the subway station, Brenner felt something break in her chest that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with grief. Sterling Ashworth was the first man she'd ever fallen in love with, and their relationship had been built on manipulation so sophisticated that she'd mistaken it for genuine kindness. The worst part wasn't that he'd lied to her. The worst part was that everything he'd given her, the wedding venue, the job opportunity, probably a dozen other advantages she hadn't even discovered yet, had been motivated by real love. Sterling had manipulated her life because he cared about her happiness, which somehow made his control more devastating than if it had been calculated cruelty. As Manhattan autumn rain began to fall in earnest, Brenner found herself crying for the first time since her parents died, mourning not just the loss of Sterling, but the loss of her own naive belief that love could exist without power dynamics, that someone could care about her without trying to manage her life. By the time she reached her small apartment, Brenner had made a decision that felt both necessary and heartbreaking. Tomorrow, she would resign from New Horizons Youth Services and find work that had no connection to Sterling Ashworth's foundation network. She would rebuild her career based entirely on her own efforts, even if it meant starting over from the beginning. Sterling Ashworth loved her enough to let her go, and she loved him enough to ensure that his influence could never taint her achievements again. It was the most painful proof of mutual love she could imagine, and it was exactly why their relationship was impossible. 3 days after the most devastating conversation of his life, Sterling Ashworth sat in his executive office overlooking Manhattan, staring at quarterly reports he couldn't focus on, while Declan Montgomery watched him with growing concern. "You look like hell," Declan said finally, closing his laptop and giving Sterling his complete attention. "When's the last time you slept, or ate something other than coffee?" Sterling glanced up from financial projections that might as well have been written in ancient Greek for all the sense they made to his distracted mind. "I'm fine. You're many things, but fine isn't one of them." What happened with Brenna Calloway? The question hit Sterling like cold water, shocking in its directness. Declan knew about Brenna, not the details, but enough to recognize that Sterling's recent distraction had a human cause rather than a business explanation. "Nothing happened," Sterling replied carefully. "Miss Calloway and I had a professional relationship that has concluded." Declan's dark eyes studied Sterling's face with the intensity of someone who'd known him for 15 years and could read every subtle expression. "Professional relationship, my foot. You arranged her sister's wedding venue, didn't you? And probably her new job at that non-profit foundation you're so secretive about." Sterling's silence was answer enough. "Jesus, Sterling. Please tell me you didn't try to buy her affection with charitable gestures. I tried to remove obstacles that were preventing her from achieving her potential." Sterling said quietly. "It didn't work out as planned. Because she discovered the manipulation and called you on it. Because she discovered my interference and rightfully questioned my motivations." Declan leaned back in his chair, shaking his head with something that looked like frustrated affection. "You care about her, more than I've ever cared about anyone," Sterling admitted. "Which is exactly why she was right to walk away." "Walk away from what? From a relationship with someone who thinks love means controlling circumstances instead of respecting choices." The admission hung in Sterling's office like something heavy and inescapable. For 3 days, he'd been replaying his conversation with Brenna, recognizing with terrible clarity that he'd reproduced every controlling behavior he'd spent years criticizing in his father. He'd used money and influence to manipulate Brenna's circumstances, then called it love when she'd responded to his orchestrated kindness. Declan was quiet for several minutes, apparently processing the implications of Sterling's confession. When he spoke again, his voice was gentler than Sterling had expected. "You know what your problem is? I'm sure you're about to tell me. You've spent so many years protecting yourself from people who wanted to use you that you forgot how to care about someone without trying to control the outcome." The observation was so accurate that Sterling felt it like a physical blow. He'd learned manipulation from Harrison Ashworth, who viewed every human interaction as a chess game with winners and losers. When Sterling had fallen in love with Brenna, he'd instinctively used the only relationship model he'd ever known, strategic control disguised as generous assistance. "She saw right through it," Sterling said quietly. "Called it exactly what it was. Puppet master behavior dressed up as romance. Because she's intelligent and independent and probably sees manipulation coming from a mile away after years of taking care of herself and her sister. Because she deserves better than what I gave her." Declan studied Sterling's face with growing concern. "What did you give her exactly? Love that was more about my need to feel useful than her need for assistance. Help that was really control. Kindness that was actually manipulation designed to make her trust me. And now she's rebuilding her career without any connection to my foundation network, which means she's probably working multiple jobs to pay rent while finishing her graduate degree. She's doing exactly what I tried to prevent, struggling financially while pursuing work that matches her passion and intelligence." Sterling's voice broke slightly on the last sentence, recognizing that his interference had ultimately cost Brenna both the financial stability she'd earned at the Sterling Club and the career advancement he'd tried to provide through non-profit connections. "So fix it," Declan said simply. "There's nothing to fix. She made her choice, and it was the right choice. I manipulated her life. She recognized it, and she ended our relationship before it could become more damaging. I'm not talking about fixing the relationship, though God knows you should probably try that too. I'm talking about fixing your behavior, learning to love someone without trying to control their choices." Sterling looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe Brenna Calloway is the best thing that ever happened to you, not because she accepted your manipulation, but because she called you on it. Maybe losing her is exactly the wake-up call you needed, to stop reproducing your father's worst behaviors. The suggestion that losing Brenner could lead to positive change felt both hopeful and terrifying. Sterling had spent 3 days mourning the end of their relationship, but he hadn't considered the possibility that her brutal honesty might have given him the chance to become someone worthy of real love. "What if it's too late?" he asked quietly. "What if it's not?" Declan replied. "What if becoming the person she deserved in the first place is more important than winning her back? What if learning to love without control is worth pursuing, even if she never forgives you?" Sterling was quiet for a long time, staring out his office windows at Manhattan's autumn afternoon. Declan's question suggested a path forward that had nothing to do with grand gestures or strategic manipulation. A path that required fundamental character change rather than clever problem-solving. "How do I learn to love without control?" Sterling asked finally. "Start by examining every impulse to manage other people's choices," Declan replied. "Practice offering support that people can accept or reject without consequences. Learn the difference between helping and interfering. And if she's already moved on, then you'll have become a better person because she inspired you to grow, even if she never benefits from that growth." That's what real love looks like, Sterling. Caring more about someone's well-being than about whether they choose you. The conversation continued for another hour, but Sterling's mind had already shifted into planning mode. Not planning to win Brenner back. He'd lost that right when he'd chosen manipulation over respect. Instead, he was planning to become someone who deserved love that was freely given rather than strategically obtained. That evening, Sterling began the most important project of his life, transforming himself from someone who used love as control into someone capable of loving without conditions. It was work that would take months, possibly years, and might never lead to reconciliation with Brenner. But for the first time since their devastating conversation at Café Luna, Sterling felt something that wasn't grief or regret. He felt hope that he could become worthy of the kind of love Brenner deserved, even if she chose to share it with someone else. 2 months later, Sterling Ashworth stood in the main lobby of the Sterling Club, addressing the assembled staff with words he'd never imagined speaking publicly. "For 3 years, I have used this institution to indulge the worst aspects of my character," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the marble space. "I have treated dedicated professionals with deliberate cruelty, tested your resilience for my own entertainment, and created an environment where excellent service was met with calculated humiliation." The staff members gathered before him, waiters, concierges, housekeeping, kitchen personnel, security guards, listened with expressions ranging from shock to suspicion. Many of them had been victims of Sterling's legendary cruelty. Others had simply heard the stories that made grown professionals quit their jobs rather than serve him. Marcus Thompson stood near the reception desk where Brenner had once worked, his face carefully neutral as he watched Sterling deliver what sounded like a complete repudiation of his past behavior. Effective immediately, Sterling continued, "I am implementing policy changes that will ensure no member of this club ever again uses their influence to diminish or demean staff members. Zero tolerance for verbal abuse, clearly defined protocols for reasonable service requests, and independent oversight to ensure these standards are maintained." He paused, looking around the lobby at faces that reflected years of carefully hidden resentment and professional endurance. "More importantly, I want each of you to know that my past behavior was inexcusable, regardless of whatever personal issues motivated it. You deserved better treatment than I provided, and I am committed to demonstrating through consistent action that fundamental change is possible." A murmur ran through the assembled staff, not applause, but something that sounded like cautious recognition that this apology was unprecedented in Sterling Club history. Sterling had spent 2 months working with a therapist to understand the psychological patterns that had led him to reproduce his father's controlling behaviors. He'd examined every interaction with Brenna, recognizing how his need to feel useful had overridden his respect for her autonomy. He'd practiced offering help that could be accepted or rejected without consequences, learned to distinguish between support and interference. The work had been painful and humbling, but it had also been transformative in ways that extended far beyond his relationship with Brenna. Sterling was discovering who he could be when he stopped using money and influence as weapons of control. After the staff meeting concluded, Sterling walked through the club's elegant spaces with new eyes. The mahogany reception desk, where Brenna had first challenged his cruelty. The private dining room, where her flawless event coordination had forced him to acknowledge her exceptional competence. The windows overlooking Manhattan, where he'd watched her leave after their final conversation. Every location held memories of a woman who'd seen through his protective armor to the wounded person beneath, then refused to accept love that came with conditions attached. Sterling's phone buzzed with a message from Victoria Chen. Brenna Calloway started a new position with Metropolitan Children's Services, completely independent of foundation funding. Thought you should know she's succeeding on her own terms. The update should have felt like vindication, proof that Brenna was thriving without his interference. Instead, it felt like evidence of exactly how much his manipulation had cost her. She'd given up non-profit work she was passionate about to ensure complete independence from his influence, then rebuilt her career from scratch to avoid any taint of his assistance. Sterling typed back, "Thank you for letting me know. Please don't mention my inquiry to her." That evening, Sterling sat in his penthouse apartment reviewing proposals for a new foundation initiative focused on supporting young adults transitioning out of foster care. The program would provide comprehensive services, education assistance, job training, housing support, mental health resources without requiring beneficiaries to know the funding source. It was work inspired by Brenna's thesis research, designed to serve the population she cared about most. But unlike his previous charitable efforts, this foundation would operate with complete transparency about its connection to the Ashworth family, allowing recipients to make informed choices about accepting assistance. Sterling's commitment to this work had nothing to do with winning Brenna back and everything to do with honoring what she taught him about love, that enhanced rather than diminished other people's autonomy. He was creating programs that would serve vulnerable young people whether or not Brenna ever knew about his involvement, whether or not she ever forgave him for his past manipulation. 3 weeks later, the Sterling Club's transformation had become apparent to anyone who spent time in the elegant space. Staff members moved with renewed confidence, their interactions with difficult members protected by clear policies that prioritized dignity over deference. The atmosphere felt lighter, more professional, less charged with the tension that had characterized Sterling's previous presence. Sterling himself had become someone the staff recognized but barely knew, polite, considerate, and completely unremarkable in his treatment of service personnel. The man who'd once made grown professionals quit their jobs had transformed into a member who said please and thank you, left appropriate tips, and never raised his voice regardless of circumstances. On a Tuesday afternoon in late November, Sterling was leaving the club when he saw a familiar figure through the tall windows. Brenna Calloway walking quickly down the sidewalk, her dark hair catching afternoon light as she moved with the same purposeful grace he remembered. For a moment, Sterling simply watched her, noting the confident set of her shoulders and the determined pace that suggested professional satisfaction rather than the desperate rushing of someone juggling multiple survival jobs. Victoria's information had been accurate. Brenna was succeeding on her own terms. She looked beautiful and strong and completely self-possessed, exactly as she'd always been before his interference had temporarily derailed her career trajectory. Watching her navigate Manhattan's crowded sidewalks with obvious confidence, Sterling felt something that wasn't regret or longing, but something closer to deep satisfaction that she was thriving without his management. Sterling made no move to approach her, no attempt to engineer a chance encounter or create circumstances that would force interaction. Instead, he stood at the club's entrance, watching the woman he loved disappear into Manhattan's autumn afternoon, and felt proud that he'd learned to love her well enough to let her go. But as he turned to head home, Sterling's phone buzzed with an unexpected message from Marcus Thompson. "She asks about you sometimes. Just thought you should know." The text created a dangerous flutter of hope in Sterling's chest. Hope that perhaps Brenner's feelings hadn't been entirely destroyed by his manipulation, that perhaps the love they'd acknowledged during their devastating final conversation still existed beneath her necessary anger and disappointment. Sterling stared at Marcus's message for a long time, recognizing it as both a gift and a test. The old Sterling would have used this information strategically, would have found ways to position himself in Brenner's path and orchestrate opportunities for reconciliation. The new Sterling deleted the message without responding, understanding that Marcus's information was shared out of kindness but couldn't be used as leverage for manipulation. If Brenner wanted to see him, she would make that choice independently. If she didn't, he would respect her decision without attempting to influence it. As Sterling walked through Manhattan's quiet evening streets toward his apartment, he felt something that was both painful and peaceful. The recognition that he'd finally learned to love Brenner Calloway the way she deserved to be loved, completely and without conditions, even if that love meant accepting her absence from his life. It was, he thought, as autumn rain began to fall on the city they both called home, the most difficult and most necessary lesson he'd ever learned about what it truly meant to love someone well. 1 year later, Brenner Calloway stood in the Meridian Gallery, watching her sister dance with Nathan under the same string lights where they'd celebrated their wedding. But this time the occasion was their first anniversary party, a smaller, more intimate gathering that felt like a celebration of dreams successfully achieved. The venue looked exactly as magical as it had 12 months ago, but everything else had transformed in ways Brenner could never have imagined during those desperate weeks when Indy's original venue had cancelled and her own world had felt on the verge of collapse. Now, as Director of Program Development at Metropolitan Children's Services, Brenner had spent the past year building comprehensive support systems for young adults transitioning out of foster care, work that combined her academic research with practical implementation in ways that created measurable change in people's lives. Her salary wasn't enormous, but it was enough to live comfortably while making a difference, and every achievement felt entirely her own. "You look happy," Indy said, appearing at Brenner's elbow with 2 glasses of champagne and a smile that radiated contentment. Like, really, truly happy. Not just happy, because other people are happy. "I am happy," Brenner replied, accepting the champagne and realizing the statement was completely true. For the first time in her adult life, she felt genuinely satisfied with both her professional success and personal fulfillment. "It's because of him, isn't it?" Indy's eyes drifted toward the gallery's entrance, where Sterling Ashworth had just arrived, his platinum hair catching the warm light as he paused to speak with Nathan's parents. Brenner followed her sister's gaze, feeling the familiar flutter in her chest that Sterling's presence always created. But now the feeling wasn't complicated by questions about manipulation or power dynamics. It was simply the joy of seeing someone she loved completely and who loved her with equal respect and devotion. "It's because of us," she corrected gently, "because we learned how to love each other well." The journey to that love had been neither simple nor quick. After their devastating confrontation at Café Luna 15 months ago, Brenner and Sterling had spent 6 months apart, she rebuilding her career independently, he undergoing the kind of fundamental character transformation that required professional help and brutal self-examination. Their reconnection had happened purely by chance 3 months ago, when Brenner had encountered Sterling at a foster care advocacy event where he was volunteering, not funding or managing, but actually serving meals and listening to young people's stories with genuine attention and respect. The man she'd found there was recognizably Sterling Ashworth, but also someone entirely new, humble where he'd once been arrogant, supportive where he'd once been controlling, willing to follow her lead in conversations about social justice rather than assuming his money gave him authority over subjects he was still learning about. They'd talked for 2 hours that night, carefully and honestly about what they'd learned during their separation. Sterling had described his work with a therapist to understand how his fear of abandonment had led him to reproduce his father's controlling behaviors. Brenner had explained her journey toward recognizing that accepting help didn't require surrendering autonomy. That partnership could enhance rather than diminish individual strength. When Sterling had asked if she might be willing to have dinner with him, not as a member and former employee, but as two people who'd grown enough to attempt something entirely different, Brenner had said yes, because the man making the invitation respected her right to say no without consequences. Their courtship had been deliberate and transparent, built on conversations about values and boundaries and shared dreams for how they wanted to change the world. Sterling never made decisions about Brenner's life without consulting her. Brenner never accepted Sterling's assistance without clearly defining the terms and ensuring her autonomy remained intact. They'd learned to support each other's goals while maintaining separate identities and independent achievements. The result was a relationship that felt like true partnership, two complete people choosing to build something together rather than two wounded people trying to heal each other's deficiencies. Brenner. Sterling's voice was warm with affection as he approached them, his ice-blue eyes holding the kind of genuine happiness she'd never seen during their time at the Sterling Club. Indy. Congratulations on surviving your first year of marriage with this wonderful man. Thank you, Indy replied, grinning, and congratulations on surviving 6 months of engagement to my sister. How are the wedding preparations going? Slowly and democratically, Sterling said, his slight smile indicating he was learning to find humor in his own growth process. We've discovered that planning a wedding, when both people have strong opinions and equal decision-making power, requires significantly more negotiation than either of us anticipated. But it's fun negotiation, Brenner added, touching Sterling's arm with casual affection. We're learning that compromise feels different when both people have equal power in the relationship. The three of them chatted for several minutes about wedding details, work updates, and Indy's latest art project, a painting series inspired by her experience as someone who'd been raised by a sister rather than parents. The conversation felt natural and comfortable, with none of the careful formality that had once characterized Sterling's interactions with Brenner's family. When Nathan appeared to claim his wife for another dance, Brenner and Sterling found themselves alone by the gallery's floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the Hudson River reflect city lights in patterns that shifted with the current. "How are the Horizon House interviews going?" Sterling asked, referring to the transitional housing program that represented the most ambitious project of Brenner's career. "Better than expected," Brenner replied. "We've identified 12 young people who'll be perfect for the first cohort, and the funding is completely secure for the initial 3-year pilot program." The funding for Horizon House came from a coalition of foundations and government sources that Brenner had assembled through her own professional networks, with no connection to Sterling's charitable work. It was exactly the kind of program she'd envisioned in her graduate thesis, comprehensive support that helped young adults build sustainable independence without creating dependency. "And your board meeting tomorrow?" Brenner asked, turning the conversation to Sterling's work. "Should be productive. We're approving funding for 5 new organizations that serve foster children, including a mentorship program that pairs successful alumni with current teenagers. All the proposals came through the standard application process. Completely transparent funding sources, and extensive community input about which programs would be most effective. Sterling's foundation work had evolved dramatically over the past year, guided by principles of transparency and community-driven decision-making rather than top-down philanthropy. He'd learned to see his wealth as a tool for amplifying other people's expertise rather than imposing his own vision on social problems he was still learning about. "I'm proud of the work you're doing," Brenner said quietly. "You've become someone who uses influence to enhance other people's power rather than control their choices." Sterling's ice-blue eyes held hers with gentle intensity. "I had an excellent teacher in what healthy support looks like. You had excellent motivation to learn." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching autumn moonlight paint silver patterns across the river. Their engagement had been announced 3 months ago, after Sterling had proposed with a family heirloom ring and an offer to co-found a new organization that would combine Brenner's programmatic expertise with resources that could scale her vision nationally. The proposal had been perfect not because of the ring or the romantic setting, but because Sterling had offered partnership that enhanced Brenner's professional goals rather than limiting them. When she'd said yes, it had been to both the marriage and the foundation work, a choice to build a life together that would serve their shared values while respecting their individual strengths. "Sterling," Brenner said softly, "are you ready for tomorrow night?" Tomorrow night was their return to the Sterling Club, but not as member and employee. This time, Brenner would enter as the newest member of the club's board of directors, invited to join based on her expertise in non-profit management and community development. Sterling would be there as her colleague and partner, supporting her leadership on initiatives that aligned with both their values. The invitation to join the board had come through completely legitimate channels. Marcus Thompson, now the club's director of member services, had recommended Brenner for a position that required someone with her specific background in social services and organizational development. The appointment had nothing to do with Sterling's influence and everything to do with her professional qualifications and track record of successful program implementation. "I'm proud to watch you take your place as an equal in spaces where you were once expected to serve," Sterling replied. "It's exactly what you deserve and what the club needs." The Sterling Club itself had undergone dramatic transformation over the past year, with new policies that emphasized respectful treatment of staff and community engagement over exclusive privilege. The changes had been driven partly by Sterling's advocacy as a board member, but mostly by younger members who wanted the institution to reflect contemporary values rather than outdated hierarchies. As the anniversary party continued around them, Brenner found herself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. 15 months ago, she'd been a concierge who felt invisible to wealthy members, spending her energy managing other people's lives while putting her own dreams on hold. Sterling had been a man so wounded by past betrayal that he'd used cruelty as armor, driving away anyone who might get close enough to hurt him. Now they were two people who'd learned to support each other's growth while maintaining their individual strength, who'd discovered that real love enhanced rather than diminished personal power, who'd built a relationship based on mutual respect and shared commitment to making the world better for vulnerable young people. "Ms. Calloway," Sterling said formally, offering his arm with exaggerated gallantry, "would you honor me with a dance?" "Mr. Ashworth," Brenner replied with equally formal dignity, accepting his arm with a smile that held all the warmth their professional interactions had once lacked. "I would be delighted." As they moved onto the small dance floor, where Indy and Nathan were swaying to gentle music, Brenner marveled at how different this felt from their careful conversations at the reception desk where they'd first met. Then, every word had been loaded with power dynamics and unspoken tension. Now their communication felt effortless, built on trust and mutual understanding rather than strategic maneuvering. "Do you ever miss it?" Sterling asked quietly as they danced. "The simplicity of not caring about anyone deeply enough to be vulnerable." Brenna considered the question seriously. "Sometimes I miss feeling completely self-sufficient," she admitted. "But I don't miss the loneliness that came with emotional walls. I miss the illusion of control," Sterling said. "But I don't miss the emptiness that came with keeping everyone at safe distance." They continued dancing as the evening moved toward its gentle conclusion, surrounded by family and friends who'd watched their relationship develop from cautious reconnection to genuine partnership. The transformation in both of them was visible to anyone who'd known them during their earlier, more guarded phases of life. When the party finally ended and guests began to drift toward the exit, Brenna hugged Indy with tears in her eyes. "Thank you for never giving up on your dreams," Indy whispered. "Watching you fight for this relationship taught me that love is supposed to help people become more themselves, not less." "Thank you for reminding me that I deserve happiness too," Brenna replied. "You were right when you said I spent too much time taking care of everyone else and not enough time thinking about what I wanted for myself." As Sterling said goodbye to Nathan's family and made arrangements to have flowers sent to Indy and Nathan the next day, Brenna found herself looking around the gallery space where so much of their story had unfolded. The venue that had seemed like a crisis solution had become the setting for some of their most important conversations about trust, support, and learning to love without manipulation. "Ready to go home?" Sterling asked, appearing at her side with their coats. "Actually," Brenna said, checking her watch and realizing it was only 9:30. "Are you interested in making a quick stop somewhere first?" Sterling's expression shifted to curious attention. "Where did you have in mind?" "The Sterling Club. I know it sounds strange, but I'd like to see the space where we first met, now that we're returning tomorrow as equals." Sterling smiled with obvious delight at the suggestion. "I think that sounds perfect." 20 minutes later, they stood in the Sterling Club's marble lobby, but everything felt different from Brenna's memories of working there. The space looked exactly the same. Mahogany reception desk, crystal chandeliers, leather armchairs arranged in intimate conversation areas. But the atmosphere had been transformed by policy changes that prioritized dignity and mutual respect over rigid hierarchy. Marcus Thompson appeared from the administrative offices, grinning when he saw them. "Brenna, Sterling, what brings you here so late?" "Nostalgia," Brenna replied. "I wanted to see the reception desk where I first told Mr. Ashworth that I'd be happy to call security to escort him out entirely." Marcus laughed with obvious delight. "That story has become legendary among the staff. The day someone finally stood up to Sterling Ashworth and lived to tell about it, the day I met someone who saw through my armor to the actual person underneath," Sterling corrected gently. "Best thing that ever happened to me, even though it took me far too long to recognize it." "How are the new staff training programs working out?" Brenna asked, genuinely curious about the club's transformation. "Incredibly well," Marcus replied. "Sterling's been volunteering to train new employees on respectful member interaction, which means people learn from someone who used to be the worst possible example of how to treat service staff. It's remarkably effective." Brenna looked at Sterling with surprise and pride. "You're training staff now?" Sterling's expression held a hint of embarrassment mixed with satisfaction. "Turns out I have extensive experience in how not to treat people with dignity, which makes me uniquely qualified to teach better approaches. It's therapeutic, actually, making amends through practical education rather than just apologies." The conversation continued for several minutes, with Marcus updating them on club improvements and upcoming community engagement initiatives that would use the venue for educational programs serving local families. The Sterling Club was becoming an institution that contributed to community development rather than simply catering to exclusive privilege. When Marcus excused himself to finish closing procedures, Brenner and Sterling found themselves alone in the lobby where their relationship had begun, with hostile verbal sparring and mutual recognition of intellectual equality. "Do you remember what you were thinking the first time you saw me?" Brenner asked, moving to stand behind the mahogany reception desk where she'd once worked. Sterling joined her in the space, his expression thoughtful as he considered the question. "I was thinking that you looked like someone who wouldn't be easily intimidated, and I was curious whether that impression was accurate or just wishful thinking on my part." Wishful thinking. I'd been cruel to so many people by then that I was beginning to wonder if anyone would ever challenge me instead of just enduring my behavior. When you threatened to call security, I felt relieved, actually, like I'd finally met someone strong enough to stand up to me. Brenner leaned against the reception desk, studying Sterling's face in the soft lobby lighting. "And what are you thinking now?" "I'm thinking that you saved my life by refusing to accept treatment that diminished your dignity. I'm thinking that I love you more for making me earn your respect than I would have if you'd given it easily. I'm thinking that tomorrow, when we walk into the boardroom as colleagues, it will be the proudest moment of my professional life." The words were delivered with quiet sincerity that made Brenner's heart race, just as it had during their very first exchange at this desk. But now the acceleration came from love and anticipation rather than defensive adrenaline. "I'm thinking that you're the only person who's ever seen me as completely capable and worth fighting for," Brenner replied. "I'm thinking that watching you transform from someone who used power to hurt people into someone who uses influence to help them has been the most inspiring experience of my life. I'm thinking that I can't wait to see what we build together when we combine your resources with my programming expertise." Sterling moved closer, reaching up to touch her face with the kind of gentle reverence that still surprised her after months of experiencing his transformed approach to physical affection. "Brenner Calloway," he said softly, using her full name the way he had during their most formal professional interactions. "Will you marry me again?" The question caught her off guard. "Again. I propose to you with a foundation partnership and a family ring," Sterling explained. "But I want to propose again, here in the place where we first met, with nothing but the promise to love you as an equal partner for the rest of our lives. No business ventures, no charitable projects, no strategic advantages. Just two people choosing each other freely and completely." Brenner felt tears threaten as she understood what Sterling was offering, a proposal that was purely about love and commitment, separate from all the practical considerations that had been part of their original engagement. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you again and again, every day for the rest of our lives." When Sterling kissed her in the marble lobby of the Sterling Club, surrounded by the elegant space where they'd first challenged each other to become better people, Brenner felt the perfect completion of a story that had begun with hostility and evolved into the deepest love either of them had ever experienced. They were interrupted by gentle applause from Marcus, who'd returned from his closing duties and witnessed their impromptu reproposal. "Best thing that ever happened to this place," he said warmly. "You two proving that people can actually change and grow and build something beautiful together." As they finally left the Sterling Club and walked through Manhattan's quiet autumn night toward Sterling's apartment where they now lived together, Brenner found herself thinking about all the young people who would benefit from the programs they were building, all the relationships that would be healthier because they'd learned to model partnership based on mutual respect rather than power dynamics. "Sterling," she said as they reached his building. "Our building," she corrected herself, still adjusting to the reality of shared space and combined lives. "Yes, I love you enough to let you go, and you love me enough to stay," she said, echoing the devastating conclusion of their breakup conversation, but inverting its meaning. That's exactly why this works now. Sterling stopped walking, turning to face her with an expression of wonder and recognition, because we both chose growth over safety and partnership over control. Because we learned that real love makes people more themselves, not less. Because we discovered that the strongest relationships are built by two complete people who choose each other freely. They stood together on the sidewalk outside their shared home, surrounded by the city where they'd both learned to transform pain into purpose, where they'd discovered that love could be both powerful and respectful, both passionate and sustainable. Tomorrow, they would return to the Sterling Club as board colleagues working to make the institution more inclusive and community-focused. Next month, they would launch the foundation that combined Brenna's expertise with Sterling's resources to serve vulnerable young people. In 6 months, they would marry in a ceremony that celebrated their partnership while honoring their individual achievements. But tonight, they were simply two people who'd learned to love each other well, standing together under Manhattan stars and planning a future that would honor both their dreams and their shared commitment to making the world better for everyone who needed second chances. As they finally entered their building and rode the elevator toward the home they'd created together, a space that reflected both their personalities while providing room for continued individual growth, Brenna thought about the conversation they'd had at Café Luna 15 months ago, when Sterling had accused her of rarely pursuing things purely for her own happiness. Now she knew what her own happiness looked like. A career that made a difference, a partnership that enhanced rather than diminished her strength, a love that was freely chosen and mutually respectful, and a future that combined personal fulfillment with service to others who needed support. Sterling Ashworth had started as the man who made grown professionals quit their jobs rather than endure his cruelty. Brenna Calloway had started as someone who'd spent years managing other people's lives while putting her own dreams on hold. Together, they'd become two people who'd learned that the strongest love was built on equal partnership, that the most meaningful success came from using privilege to enhance other people's opportunities, and that the happiest ending was really just the beginning of a shared adventure in building something beautiful together. As they settled into their apartment that evening, surrounded by books on social justice and foundation management, photos from Indy's wedding and their own engagement party, and plans for programs that would serve hundreds of young people over the coming years, Brenna realized that she'd finally found what she'd never known she was looking for: a love story that enhanced everyone it touched, a partnership that made both people stronger, and a future that promised continued growth rather than static contentment. Sterling Ashworth had once made waiters quit on the spot. Then a brave woman had stood her ground and discovered that beneath his cruelty was someone capable of extraordinary love, someone worth fighting for, someone who could learn to love others with the same fierce protection she'd shown for her sister's happiness. Their story had begun with conflict and evolved into collaboration, started with power struggles and developed into equal partnership, emerged from individual wounds and grown into shared healing. It was, Brenna thought as she fell asleep in Sterling's arms that night, exactly the kind of love story that made believing in second chances feel like the most practical decision in the world. And in the morning, they would wake up ready to continue building that story together, one respectful conversation and one thoughtful decision at a time, for all the years they had left to love each other well. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.